Okay, I guess.
Oh, everybody can have two.
It doesn't matter, I'm not going anywhere tonight anyway. I'm going to take a little detour based on one line here. Again, if anybody has any questions from prior classes, please don't hesitate to cause me trouble. We are at section 3, dealing with the good. I make no good. This is really virtually a metaphysical topic. I've dealt a little bit with it in the past, but we have to remember that natural law ethics, which is what we will be exploring, is not just any old ethics, in the sense that many times you'll see people saying, well, according to this ethical theory system or that ethical system, we do this or that. In order to determine what is right, what is true, what is correct, you need to know the metaphysical framework in which ethics arises. And that's why the course logically presupposes both metaphysics and philosophical psychology. Without that, you just don't know the framework, and that's why you can get into all kinds of disputes. Utilitarianism is floating around in its own particular context, but it does not have the framework which requires that some things are, for example, intrinsically evil. And if they're intrinsically evil, you can't make them good, justifying them by seeking a good end. So we need the metaphysical framework in which we are operating, and that's the context in which the good arises. The good is that which all things desire, as Aristotle defines it. A thing is said to be good or desirable. The good is desirable because it's suitable or fitting to the agent seeking it. Now, the little detour I'm going to take tonight is to draw your attention to the third book of the Summa Contra Gentiles by St. Thomas Aquinas, in which he deals with providence, and in chapters, this is book 3, chapters 1 through 63, he engages in a marvelous tour de force of leading you from the beginning metaphysical fact that every agent seeks an end, ultimately to showing that man's felicity, his happiness, consists in what we would in theological terms call the beatific vision. It's an amazing journey, and he does it step by step, and that's what I wanted to just look at, share with you in a kind of passing way tonight, just by looking at the titles of the various chapters of the book. We can't spend too much time on any one of them, but what we have to grasp is that the framework which determines the structure of ethics from the point of view of the good arises from the Thomistic metaphysics. And the first principle, the first chapter he examines, is entitled, Every Agent Must Seek an End. And the way that this is proven, basically, and I'm not going to try to go through all the proofs, obviously you got a couple hundred pages here, we're not going to do that. But every agent seeks an end because if it were utterly indifferent to any given end, it would not seek this, or it would not result in this outcome rather than that outcome. There has to be a reason why a particular outcome comes to be, and that reason has to be operative in the agent as it's expressing its agency. In other words, it's got to be operative, aiming it towards a particular end from the outset. Now, again, bear in mind, in the Thomistic metaphysics, God is a creator, and he creates all things according to his own understanding of that which he wishes to express, or that which he wishes to create, and specifying it according to its properties is to give it a nature. So God creates concrete beings with specific natures. Nature, of course, we know in terms of its activity towards an end. Looking at it from our perspective, we look at, say, some element like potassium, we watch how it behaves, and from its behavior we reason back to its nature, because the nature is what accounts for the fact that it always tends to behave the same way. But from the ontological standpoint, God is creating it with that nature, and that is why it results in a certain kind of specific behavior every time. Natural scientists could not do their science if things didn't have natures, because otherwise a thing could do anything willy-nilly that it wanted to one time and then something utterly different the next time. The very possibility of classifying things presupposes that they behave in constant ways so as to produce constant results, and that amounts to saying that their natures tend towards the same result in every instance. Every nature acts for an end. And if this is true, of course, of the inanimate world, all the more so it is true in living things, and particularly sentient living things, and particularly intelligent living things. But the basic metaphysics is you just can't have an agent that's utterly indifferent to either of two outcomes. You know, it's like the old thing, if you're sitting on the railroad track and a train's coming at you and you can't make up your mind which way to get off, what's going to happen? It's going to be very messy. You got to get off one way or the other. So that entails a determination. In other words, there's got to be a sufficient reason why this outcome came to be rather than that one. And that sufficient reason is what we mean when we say that the agent is acting towards a particular end. Second chapter says that every agent acts for good. Now this one's a little more subtle in a way, but remember, the good is that which all things desire. So that if any agent is ordered towards a particular end by its nature, by definition, when it attains that end, when it attains that object that it is moving towards, it has attained something that is perfect of its nature, or its nature wouldn't be moving toward it in the first place. So that the nature of the end is also the nature of a good. Now, of course, we can see this very clearly in the case of living things like ourselves, because we know that we are always seeking things because we want them because they're desirable. If they're desirable, they're good. And we see this also in the case of the animal kingdom, where animals seek things that are either good for their own self-preservation or for the preservation of their species. And so too with the vegetative kingdom, their actions, the actions of plants and trees growing, is to attain nutrition and to set up conditions for photosynthesis, which are also good for them as individuals and good for their species. As far as the inanimate or suborganic world is concerned, you can still have recourse to the metaphysical argument that the nature of anything is ordered to something that is perfective of it, otherwise it would not be seeking it. Now, of course, you ask, well, what good does it do a sodium atom to combine with a chlorine atom? Maybe it likes being salt, I don't know, but it at least entails a certain degree of reduction of or increase of entropy, a reduction of the dynamic tension which it has before it combines with that other ion. So in a very general way, of course, from the perspective of God creating things, he gives them their natures. And the nature, again, remember, God is a supreme good, so everything is going to be ordered towards the perfection of being. Think of it in terms of being. And ultimately the being which is God himself. I'm not going to hit all of these because we've got 63 of them. He points out that evil is not what is intended when an agent is seeking the good. In other words, evil is per accidens, it's incidental. So that if an animal is seeking a certain food and in the process gets poisoned, it doesn't get poisoned because it was seeking the poison. It gets poisoned because the food it was seeking to maintain its life happens to have been in the food. I'm not going to try hitting all of these, but the point that we are concerned with is to show that there is a metaphysical foundation leading up to the human condition. In a certain sense, he says the good is the cause of evil. Why? Because agents are seeking goods. In the process of seeking goods, incidentally, sometimes evils result. It happens to us, even when we're trying to cross the road and we get hit by a car. We didn't cross the road to get hit by the car, but we were in the process of crossing the road and we didn't see the car. In a certain sense, evil is based on good. I guess, let me see if we should develop a little bit the notion of evil. Remember, evil is not a thing in itself. It isn't a proper essence in itself. Evil is the lack of a due perfection. It's something that ought to be in something, but it isn't, like a horse that is blind. That's a physical evil because its nature is such that it should have sight and it doesn't have it, so that's evil. But that means there's no such thing as absolute evil. Because if you had absolute evil, you'd have absolute non-being, and non-being is nothing. So evil is a relative non-being. It's the lack of the being of sight in the horse that ought to have sight. It's the lack of virtue in a man who ought to have virtue. It's the lack of health in a man that ought to be healthy. If you are diseased, you are lacking the ease of being healthy. Don't hesitate to stop me if I pass over something you want to push on a bit. Evil doesn't wholly destroy the good. It's kind of an optimistic metaphysical point. And that is, if you had something that was absolutely evil, it would be nothing. Evil can only be understood in reference to the nature of a being, and a being is substantially good. Now, can you name something that's absolutely evil? Borrowed from theology, somebody said, well, what about Lucifer? Isn't Lucifer absolutely evil? Well, no, not at all. Lucifer was the most perfect angel that God created. So why is he so bad? Well, the old principle, the corruption of the best is the worst. He's absolutely corrupt in the moral order, but in the ontological order, he's an angel, the highest of angels. The only way you can understand evil is to understand it as the corruption or imperfection or the lack of perfection or the lack of being in something that ought to have those perfections. But to understand that it ought to have those perfections, you have to understand what its nature is. Because the nature specifies the qualities, the perfections, the operations that are proper to it. A thing is evil because it's lacking something like that. I suppose you might say, well, isn't a cancer a thing in its own right? Yes, it is, but we call it an evil because it's destroying the organs that it impinges upon. It's an evil in reference to the host, to the person who's got the cancer. The cancer itself may be doing great as a tumor. It's the old thing like the example I've used in the metaphysics. Somebody says to you, how do you feel today? And you say, well, not so good. Well, what's wrong with you? I've got a cold. Is that bad? Yeah, it's bad. I've got a cold. Well, the truth is, if you really feel rotten, you've got a good cold. And sometimes we say that, don't we? I've got a good cold. Because a cold is good. It's you that's rotten. It's you that's sick. The cold causes a disease in you, so relative to you, that's evil. But as far as the cold is concerned, it's a fantastic virus. If it's one of the best I've ever had, if it gets any better, I'll go to the hospital and die.
How would you explain the growth and the transmission of evil, the fact that it can essentially metastasize?
Evil itself? Well, it's not a thing.
Corruption
Yeah.
is a force, right? There's a dynamic element that corrupts, right? It's not.
It corrupts because of goodness. It corrupts because it's selling something that's good, like perverted sex. Sex sells because it tempts people to illicit pleasure. And that's very transmissible, understandably. And of course, people who are engaged in the misuse of sex often will try to get other people to do the same thing for the sake of their own conscience. And in that sense, that becomes, spreads like wildfire. It also may have an economic motivation behind it. But in every instance, people are seeking something good. If the economic motivation of prostitution is money, the attainment of the money is good, but the means used to attain it is not.
My question is, how can something that is nothing grow and corrupt other forms?
Well, it's not absolutely nothing. That's the point I was trying to make. It's not nothing. If it were total evil, it would be nothing, and there'd be nothing to spread. It spreads because of the goodness in it. It spreads because there's something tempting about it. There's something, whether it be power or pleasure or what have you, it's something that people are tempted by because of the goodness of it. And they are genuine goods, but they're not good relative to the whole nature of man. And in respect to the whole of man, they are destructive. So yes, sin is popular. And why people would attempt to spread it, of course, they may have other motivations, as I say, seeking the peace of their own conscience. Or it may be for economic gain. There's all kinds of reasons. The driving force of every action for every agent, though, is seeking a good. But you may know that good is not proper to your nature, and in that respect know that what you're doing is evil, but will it anyway because of the proximate fulfillment of attaining that particular good that you want. So, yeah, sure, evil's plenty popular. Sister.
So someone who walks into the bank realizes there's money there, and this person says money is good for me?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it
so
is.
his evil is enticed by the good? Is that the idea? Or how would you express
Well,
that?
the good entices us to do evil.
Okay.
In other words, I'm willing to break the law to get to the money. And the money's good. And the money will get me some good things. The problem, as we'll see later on, is that you always have to ask, is this an honest good? Is it a do good to my nature as a whole? Or is it only perfecting a part of me? I mean, if I eat and eat and eat and get so big I explode, that's not good for me, but boy, I enjoy all the food. The food is good, it tastes good. Its ultimate result may be ruin. And my doctor may tell me, stop doing it or you're going to explode. And I may explode, but I've enjoyed it all the way. I'm always seeking a good. Everybody's always seeking goods. Can't be helped. Every agent acts for good. But in the process of seeking the good, you may trip up and fall into evil. And because evil entails the acquisition of goods, it's very popular. There are a lot of evils that are very popular for obvious reasons. I mean, you only have to look at the pornography industry or the drug industry. I don't mean the pharmaceuticals, I mean the illicit drugs, because they produce a temporary feeling of euphoria or a temporary escape from the difficulties of the world. And it's extremely popular, obviously, despite the fact that the people who are receiving it know that it's highly self-destructive. It's one of the mysteries of our fallen nature that we do things we know are wrong, and we do them willfully, even when we know they're self-destructive. For the same reason that evil is not a thing in itself, there's no such thing as a highest evil. There's a highest good, which is God. But evil always has to be understood in reference to a particular nature. Just to summarize 2 or 3 of these chapters, also, God, in making things, orders them. Remember, God is infinite being, infinite good. Everything that he makes is good. Everything that he makes is good insofar as it is, because it has a certain nature. That nature has perfection, and perfection is being. And every nature acting according to its own proper nature seeks the good, which is perfective of its being, and therefore it's seeking being. And in seeking being, it is in one way or another aiming towards the Supreme Being as its last end. In other words, you got to tie the metaphysics in here and see it all in terms of being. The infinite being creates finite beings that seek more being, and in seeking being, they are moving towards the acquisition of more and more being, which ultimately would be God. Now, obviously, little inorganic things aren't going to go very far that way, but to the extent that they act according to their nature, they're imitating God. It is only ultimately when you get to an intellective spiritual being that it really becomes something possible in a very meaningful, direct way to attain God as our last end. That's how we'll get back to the ethics that we're talking about. So again, I'm not going to hit all of these. Well, let me see. I'm not sure where to put this, because he's got one that says that to understand God is the end of every intellectual substance. We will kind of come back to that in a little bit, so I don't want to hit it too hard right now. But the reason for that is that man by nature seeks to understand. What we understand is being, and we want to understand more and more being. God is the ultimate being. So that by our very nature, we ultimately, if we could know God, would want, that would be the end of the perfect fulfillment of our desire to know. And of course, as we will see, the problem is you can have knowledge of God, but it's not completely satisfactory. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. He gets into the question of what is entailed in attaining felicity. That's the word this book uses. We would normally call it happiness. What does a human being have to do to attain happiness? And what does happiness consist in? And this is where he gets into the various alternatives that are proposed by different ethical theories and different people down through history. He says human happiness does not consist in the pleasures of the flesh. Some people, of course, have said that it is. For instance, the hedonists. Why not? What's wrong with the pleasures of the flesh? I mean, obviously they're good. They're enjoyable. I touched upon this in an earlier class, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But obviously it is a good, but the difficulty is that pleasure is something that is always attendant to some other good that is proper to the individual or the species. In other words, if I enjoy pleasure of eating, the eating I may seek, the end of myself as an agent is to enjoy the pleasure of the food, but the purpose, the end of the act of eating in a human being or any animal is nutrition. It's to keep the body going. It's to keep us alive. So that pleasure can't be the ultimate end of our nature because it's only a means to an end. Same thing with sex. Sex is not an end in itself. The pleasure is there to induce the actions which will procreate the individual and keep the species going. So clearly, the end of our nature can't be seeking pleasure because pleasure isn't an end in itself. It's simply an inducement to actions that are good either for the individual or for the species. That doesn't mean you can't enjoy a chocolate bar or a good wine, but you have to understand that you're eating the chocolate bar because you enjoy it, but the chocolate bar is doing its little job of giving you nutrition, maybe giving you more weight than you wish, but it's there doing its thing and it doesn't care why you're eating it.
So what about recreational drugs? Because it doesn't seem that there's a good intrinsic to recreational drugs. It could provide pleasure.
Well, that is the problem. They're providing pleasure, but it's disoriented from the good of the whole person. And that, of course, is an argument against pleasure being the end, because pleasure there is leading us to our own destruction. And as I mentioned earlier, pleasure doesn't last forever, because our senses become dulled as we get older, and it's something that young people will go after with abandon, but as you get older, you begin to realize this isn't going to work. I'm not going to make it. Mr.
Well, the
Bernard.
latest twist on this I heard this week was that, I actually heard this was not a comedy show. Though one of Rick Perry's supporters pointed out that Rick Perry is a family man because he had his uncle do his vasectomy.
Okay. Well, it was his aunt, he was his uncle. The next point is, I don't know how to, for an encore to that one. The next point is that happiness does not consist in honors. You know, some people think, I want all kinds of honors. And with this, the next one goes glory. The problem with honors is we may not deserve them. They're not a thing in themselves, and obviously they're ephemeral, and they may be had when we shouldn't have them, and they may not be had when we should have them. Glory is like honor, but it's where everybody recognizes how honorable you should be. I guess it's a hyper form of honor, but obviously anybody seeking honors is pretty shallow, shall we say. Man's happiness does not consist in riches. Well, the real problem with riches is that it is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself, unless you're Uncle Scrooge McDuck and you just enjoy playing in all of your gold and silver coins. I was interested to note that St. Thomas, one of the reasons he says that riches is not our end is because of the instability of having riches. As we all know, with today's economic conditions, yes, that's very true. You're rich one day and you're selling apples on the street the next day. This actually happened to people in the last depression. I hesitate to describe what we're presently in. I'm hoping that we're not about to prove that such a thing as a greater depression, but clearly riches are not something one can pursue. And I've always thought it interesting that rich people often go bankrupt. You know why? Because they can't resist going for a bigger deal, and they risk more of what they've got. You'd say, well, if I had $1 million, I'd just keep it. No, if you got $1 million, why not go for two? And in going for two, you lose it all. And so, I think it was Thomas Edison, was it, who was rich and bankrupt several times. Happiness does not consist in worldly power. Well, as we've seen a lot in recent years, if the people have a lot of worldly power, often wind up being beheaded or hanged. It's not really a safe thing to do by any means, and of course, it really, in terms of natural law and human ethics, it often leads to corruption on the part of those who have the power. And with power, of course, one can do either great good or great evil, which means it isn't the power that makes you good or bad, but something else. It's the way that you use the power, which indicates that ethics must somehow be different than power. And power, just like riches, can cease to be. Happiness does not consist in the goods of the body. I guess that would mean health, because again, obviously, we don't tend to keep it, do we? And all of these things, you notice, are beginning to come around to one little factor in human experience, and that is whatever goods we have, they're awfully hard to hang on to. We try to find, it's like trying to find an investment today that's really safe. Good luck. Don't even say gold. That's not always safe either. Besides, the government taxes all gains on gold at 28%. If you've got the actual metal, you pay 28%. And during the last depression, there I said it, the first thing that FDR did was to make it illegal to own gold. You had to turn it all in or face a $10,000 fine or I don't know how many years in jail. So that didn't work too well either. Human happiness does not lie in the senses. Well, there again, obviously, one of the things you have to remember is that the philosophical psychology The senses are subordinate to the intellect. So the real end of man can't be really in anything of the body, because the body is subordinate to the spiritual soul. And of course, any good of the body can be lost, including health. He even goes to say that man's ultimate happiness does not lie in the moral virtues. Why? Because moral virtues, prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude, these are, George?
Means to an end.
They're means to an end. They're the means to the perfection of the person. They're not the end itself. And so, he's got some other things here that lead us in the same direction. He finally says that the ultimate happiness of man consists in the contemplation of God. And here, notice we've shifted from all the things that are physical, belonging to the body, the sensible, we've shifted to the intellective, to the intellect. Because from philosophical psychology, we know that the proper order of man, what makes him different from the rest of creation, is that he possesses an intellectual soul. He possesses a spiritual soul. And that's why all these other things, the material, the power, the lion has power, but who wants to be a lion? The physical things, the physical body, our material nature, is subordinated to the spiritual. And one of the obvious problems with all of those things that I named, honor, pleasure, riches, is they are ephemeral because we're going to die. Every man is mortal. Even if we possess all of them, the richest, most powerful tyrants of history all go the same way. We all return to dust. We don't possess these goods indefinitely. So if they were our ultimate end, we always live with the knowledge that we're going to lose them. Inevitably, we're going to lose them, and therefore they cannot make us perfectly happy. You know, when you want to be happy, because that's what we're talking about, how do you get happy? Ethics is a science of what is it you got to do to attain happiness? And can you be completely happy if I tell you, well, go ahead, enjoy yourself, but you realize it's going to come to an end. It's going to come to an end. That's one of the problems that the atheist has, who says, you know, my life is, I'm perfectly happy as an atheist. Yes, but as one philosopher said, no man can look death in the eye for long. It's going to go, it's going to be gone. We're going to lose it all, no matter what it is we possess. But because we have a spiritual soul, which is primarily expressed in the powers of intellect and will, man's last end transcends the body. And therefore the essence of happiness has to transcend anything of our bodily nature or of this temporal existence that we have. And he said, why would we want to have a contemplation of God? Man by nature seeks to know. We want to know. We have to, that's built into us. That's what comes with having an intellect. We want to know the nature of things around us. We want to understand our lives. Socrates says the unexamined life isn't even worth living. Philosophy grows out of the attempt to understand life and its meaning and its purpose and its direction if it has any. So by nature, because we have an intellective nature, we seek to know, we seek to understand. Sure, we want all these other things that we've been describing, at least to the extent of making life comfortable while we're in it. That would be absurd. But those things are subordinate. It'd be absurd not to want those things. But those things are subordinate to what we call the finer things in life. And even art and poetry and music, as wonderful as it is still not the ultimate satisfaction and perfection, because we want to understand what is life about, why am I here, and where am I going? And we can discern where we're going from philosophical psychology, because we know, and you see, that's why the other ethical systems would not discuss this, because they don't have the science of philosophical psychology to tell them that man's nature has a spiritual component that transcends this life, that continues to be after this life. So if we seek the purpose of our nature, it cannot be found in this life because our nature transcends this life. And we want to know, and we want to know more. We want to know more and more. That's why the entire function of all human history has been to develop the sciences and the arts and philosophy and religion, because mankind as a whole seeks to know more and more about the world and about nature and about everything that can be known. And ultimately, men turn even to philosophy. I had a course at the University of Notre Dame under Charles de Koninck, in which the whole point of it was to examine all of the great scientists of history and notice how at some point they all turned to philosophy. They all ultimately wanted to transcend this physical knowledge that they had of the world and get to something that was deeper and more permanent and more lasting and more satisfying. And in the study of metaphysics, of course, we come to an awareness of the nature of being and the transcendental analogous levels and hierarchy of being, ultimately reaching God as the highest of all beings, the creator, the infinite being, the eternal being upon which all other things are contingent. So that if you really want to ultimately know everything, you have to know God as the ultimate cause and explanation of everything. Now, the problem is, what kind of knowledge of God do we want? The knowledge that is found in common experience, where people say, I believe in God, now, it's got to be something that made this world and put order into this world. Obviously, that's not going to be too satisfactory. And obviously, it's going to be very tenuous and not at all complete. But what about the knowledge that the metaphysician has? We can demonstrate God's existence. Is that satisfactory? What's the problem with that? See, that tells us that God exists, but it doesn't tell us what God is in himself. The proofs for God's existence begin with the effects of God, the world around us. We see that this world doesn't explain itself when we penetrate it deeply and find that no adequate explanation is had until we come to a first cause uncaused, first mover unmoved, necessary being, the ultimate perfection of being that orders and governs the entire universe. The problem with that is, okay, so we know that there's this being we call God there, but what do we know of him? We know something analogously by observing what he does in the world, but it doesn't mean that we understand him in himself. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the properties of God, you'll notice something particular about them. For example, we say God is what? The infinite being. Well, what does that mean? Infinite. Venus is a limit. Infinite, not limited. So we know God is not limited. What does that mean? We know what a limited thing is because we live in a world of limited things. But that doesn't tell us in itself what it means to be infinite. We know that it's true to say that God is infinite, has no limit, such as creatures have, but all we know are the limited creatures. We know that God is immaterial. As a spiritual being, he's strictly immaterial. But immaterial is the same thing. It's a negation of a negation. It's not material. We know what matter is, but we don't know what it means. It's what we call a negative judgment of separation. In other words, we are affirming that there is a being such that it is not material, such as that it is not finite. So we are affirming something, and we are separating a certain quality, which is a limitation, from that something. So it is a kind of knowledge, but it's a limited kind. Oh, but we know that God is omnipotent and omniscient. God is all good. But all of those terms are based upon an analogy from the things that we experience in the world. of things that know things, that have partial knowledge, of things that have partial power, of things that are partially good. And by analogy, we know that God doesn't have the limitation that we find in the creature. And again, we affirm that God has goodness, but it's not the goodness that we find in the creature. God has power, but it's not the limited power that we find in the creature. Again, it's always that thing of pointing out to something that is beyond. And that's why you have this great tradition in the East, among the Eastern Platonists, because they talk about God as being inscrutable, ineffable. You can't say anything about God. That's what they're trying to get at. It doesn't mean we don't know anything about God. It just means that our knowledge is always a backdoor knowledge. It's always indirect. But you see, to know something, and you sense the frustration with it right here, to know something properly, you want to know it in itself. You don't want to know what it isn't, you want to know what it is. That's the issue. So by nature, we want to know God, and we want to know God in himself. St. Thomas dances with a lot of different views that have been made in the history of philosophy, which would not concern us right here, such as those of the positions of Alexander and Averroes. But the general thrust is that man is not going to be ultimately happy until he knows God directly in himself. But, chapter 45, he tells us that in this life we can't understand a separate substance, which is what God is. God is a substance completely separate from matter.
Doesn't substance relate to materiality?
No,
No, it doesn't.
No, it doesn't. So, every material thing is a substance, but not every substance is a material thing. This is an act of the soul. That gets into the question, what does the soul know once it's separated from the body? Which I don't want to go too far there, but there is this thing that the soul can understand itself. So that after we're dead, we would understand ourselves in a certain way, and every separated substance, every spiritual being knows that God exists because he knows that God is the cause of his being. But even in that state, in the natural order, that is not the same thing as knowing God in himself. It is simply understanding God as the source of your being, intuitively, directly, self-reflectively, unlike what it would be in this life. That still isn't satisfactory. And that's why he says, man's ultimate felicity does not come in this life, and separate substances, which could be angelic or they could be human souls after death, do not see God in his essence by knowing him through their essence. In other words, knowing your own essence is not going to enable you to know God in his essence. So the natural desire of separate substances does not come to rest in the natural knowledge they have of God. It still isn't enough. It still isn't enough. Moreover, no created substance can, by its own natural power, attain the vision of God in his essence. So in other words, you're not going to be able to do this by yourself. It's not going to work. Here, some of the terminology that I would get to at this point slips into what you probably, if you've studied it, know through theology, not through philosophy. But the bottom line is that the created intellect doesn't comprehend the divine substance. The only way you can know God in his essence is if God himself supplies the instrument, the aid, the illumination to raise your knowledge to direct knowledge of him. But even then, that doesn't mean you know God in his infinity. It doesn't mean you're going to know everything about God. In other words, you will know something of God in himself directly. This would be satisfactory. But if you were to know God as he knows himself, you'd be God. But that's asking a bit much. And this also allows then for the possibility that different people, for different reasons, would have a different participation in this direct knowledge of God. But that ultimately is what we would be seeking. Interesting little thing I came across looking at this last night, and that is that in knowing God in himself, you would know all things, all the natures that God knows, simultaneously, not successively, in a single act, because you're participating in the divine essence which is outside of time. And that St. Thomas uses as an argument that you can't lose that, because what you have done literally is to enter into eternity. And therefore it's not something that can be lost, because you have already stepped outside of time or succession or any possible condition of loss. So that, look what he's doing. He starts with every agent acts for an end, and in 63 chapters leads us all the way through all the things that people have sought in the history of the world, in human life, and finally said definitively, no, the ultimate end, the ultimate happiness, that which every intellective agent seeks, is the knowledge of the Supreme Being, the ultimate cause of all creation, knowing this God in himself. And nothing less will satisfy us. So that the end, the order of human nature, and everything we do and everything that ethics is about is preparing us, making us fit to attain our last end, which he has just described here. And that's why this is, I think, a good introduction to keep us on track as to what ethics is about, what we're really aiming for. So it's not just a bunch of little rules of how to be a good Boy Scout. It is an understanding of human nature and of all these goods that are described here that people seek, but understand that they must all be somehow subordinated and integrated into the whole of our being, so that we become, I hesitate to use the word because it sounds theological, holy, whole, in which every part and every power within our being is properly ordered, so that the lower is subordinated to the higher. And that means that the vegetative powers are subordinated to the sensitive, and the sensitive powers are subordinated to the intellective. And all that we have, if it's to keep us on track like a roadmap to our last end, all that we have needs to be ordered properly towards attaining that last end, which means by perfecting the nature that God has put in us in creating us. Because everything imitates and attains God by living up to the full perfection of its nature. And that's what we as human beings have to do. And that's also why, you see, these other ethical systems just are not looking at it from that perspective. They're walking around all kinds of other little partial glimpses, little bits and insights of things that might be of importance, but they're not looking at the whole picture. They're not looking at the whole man. They're not looking at the whole metaphysical framework in which human existence is found. All right, that's why I said I'm not getting anywhere. We just
you got plenty.
looked at a little bit of this book. The thing that utterly amazes me is you read this, and St. Thomas is writing in the greatest of detail and getting every P and Q right. And you just wonder. I mean, I've been struggling trying to write an article for months to get it just right. And I've understood that St. Thomas at times was dictating to multiple scribes simultaneously and coming up with stuff like this. All right, let's go back to our notes. We have a few more minutes here. Any questions about this? So. And some of what we're going to do here will be redundant to what I've already covered here, but it never hurts to be redundant. Okay, section 3, page 45, which is on page 5 of your notes, since we're all on the same page. The good fulfills a need in an agent. It perfects or completes its being. The good is the equivalent of being. Good is one of the transcendentals. Remember, the transcendentals are simply other names for being. The good is being as desirable. And of course, therefore, you have to distinguish between the intellectual goods and the sensitive goods. A sensitive good might be the taste of the hamburger, but the intellective good would be understanding that the hamburger will keep you alive. I don't think when a dog eats a hamburger, it's thinking to itself, this is going to keep me alive. It may be ravenously hungry and respond appropriately to its hunger. Evil is the lack of a due perfection. What do we mean by the moral good? G.E. Moore, who was one of the early linguistic analysts or positivists, claimed that you can't define the good. Now, that doesn't mean he didn't have a notion of the good. He just says, you know it when you see it. That's all. It's obvious. All right, but it's not demanding a definition. But we need a definition because this is a science. Ethics is a science. And within the science, we can define it. The moral good would be those acts that lead us toward our true last end. And ethics, in a sense, is like a roadmap because it shows us the route to take. And it shows us the blind alleys, and it shows us when you're going to go over a cliff. And the map, as you will see, largely consists of looking at ourselves, looking at our own nature. As I'm sure Dr. Waters so many times told you, human nature adequately understood or adequately considered. Now you don't need the rest of the course. Note too that the meaning of good is analogous. What that means is that the good of an atom is not the same level as the good of a carrot, is not the same as the good of a horse, is not the same as the good of a man. It's all going to be analogous, just as being is analogous through these various levels of being. Good may be delectable or pleasurable, useful, perfective or honest. You'll notice that that's, just look down underneath, it's said again, man is attracted towards the end, which is good. Goods may be useful, or they may be pleasurable. Pleasurable and delectable are the same. Or they may be honest, worthy, or perfective. So what this means is a good that is pleasurable, of course, is something that gives pleasure to our senses or even to our intellect, in the sense that we find it pleasing to understand something. We enjoy it. But a good may also be useful in the sense that it is a means to something else. Money is that kind of a good. Most of us don't really, if I said I'm going to give you $1 million, would you care if it's in cash, gold bullion, silver, or a bank order, a money order, or a cashier's check? As long as you're sure that whatever it is going to be good, you'd probably take it in any form, because it isn't the money itself in the physical representation of it that matters. It's the knowledge that you possess the legal power which it represents. And that's a power which is a means to the end of spending. St. Thomas adroitly points out that the purpose of money is to spend. It would appear our government has been studying under St. Thomas. He says it doesn't do you any good if you just have it.
St. Paul said that money is the root of all evil.
Yes.
That's right, to get rid of it and spend it as quickly as possible.
The reason people try to acquire so much money is they want to be in a position to continue spending it, you see. We want it to be the kind of spending like the loaves and the fishes, where you can keep spending it and it's still there. Doesn't go away. So many goods are useful, but the kind of good that we're most concerned about is what's called an honest or worthy good, and that really means one that's fitting to us as an entire human being. Because we often pursue things that are not fitting to us as a whole. And we do this all the time. I mean, I know I shouldn't eat that extra chocolate, but I do it anyway because it's a pleasurable good, even though I know it's not really good for me in the long run, maybe the short run. And we'll finish up on one more point here. Let's take up the 3 kinds of friendship next week if I'm here. Thank you.